This is the Texas Economic Forum. It's number 15, which means that we've been at this for 8 years. And the purpose is simply to have a dialogue about the economies of Texas and its major cities. We have 3 speakers. We've asked them to speak about 10 minutes each. And after that, we're all going to get over, the 3 of them will go over there, and we'll have a question and answer and discussion period. So Dr. Weinstein is going to talk about some energy topics. Peter Orrenius is going to do migration, creation, and business formation. And Dean Stansel is going to talk about economic freedom. So, Bud, take off.
Well, if there was a program and you looked at it, my name's not on it. And I am pinch hitting, so to speak, for Bruce Bullock, who had a conflict at the last minute. I worked with Bruce for 12 years at the McGuire Energy Institute. I retired 2 years ago, and Bruce asked if I would stand in, and I said, be happy to. And I thought what I'd talk about briefly is the energy transition, what it means for the Texas oil and gas industry. That's what I'm going to talk about. So, some of you may know this. The United States is the #1 crude oil producer in the world. And Texas accounts for about 44% of all the nation's crude oil production. America's the #1 natural gas producing country in the world. A lot of people don't know that. Texas accounts for about 27% of all the natural gas that's produced in the United States. And we're talking, onshore and offshore. Another first, did you know that in 2023, the United States became the world's #1 natural gas exporting country? We export more natural gas than any other country, including Australia and Qatar, the UAE, Russia. We are by far #1 when it comes to gas. And most of the gas that we export is exported in liquid form because we don't have a pipeline under the Atlantic. So not yet. So, the stuff is chilled in these, they're called trains, and put on these funny-looking tankers and shipped all over the world. And do you know that right now, the EU imports more liquefied gas from the United States than Russian pipeline gas? Well, that's been going on. There's also been some tremendous investments in renewables, particularly wind. This is looking at the U.S., the increase in solar generating capacity. We're up to almost 150 gigawatts of installed wind. And some of you may not know this, Texas is #1 in wind. I mean, we're #1 by far. We've got 3 or 4 times as much installed wind capacity as the #2 state. Solar's been growing. Solar is kind of catching up to wind now. Solar, they say that's where it's at. A lot of money going into solar. Of course, a lot of money's been going into renewables, as I'll show you in a minute, because of the huge subsidies that are available. But Texas, right now, is #2 in solar, and in terms of installed capacity. By next year, we'll be #1. We will surpass California in terms of installed, I'm talking about industrial scale solar, not rooftop, but industrial scale solar. And solar really helped us get through our heat wave this past summer. I think right now there's something like 15 gigawatts of solar being installed across the state of Texas. So the energy transition. What is the energy transition? We hear these terms all the time. To me, very simply, the energy transition is about electrification of the economy. We love electricity because it's perceived to be clean, it's convenient. You can do all kinds of things with electricity. You can cook, you can heat, you can drive an automobile, you can operate industrial processes with electricity. So electrification is really what the energy transition is about, and this is just showing you at the end of 22 where our electricity was coming from in the United States. Natural gas was #1. You can see that coal has been on a steep decline. Nuclear has been steady because we haven't built any new nuclear plants in 20 years. There is one just about to come online in Georgia. And then you can see renewables have grown quite significantly. So this is the holy trinity of renewables. It's wind, solar, and batteries for when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. And this chart supposedly shows what's called the levelized cost of electricity. I think the point there is that the cost of renewables has come down considerably. And when they talk about the levelized cost, that's kind of accounting for subsidies and other short-term factors that may have affected the delivered price of this type of generation. And it's also about electric vehicles. So it's the holy trinity of wind, solar, batteries, and electric vehicles. Of course, we want the wind and the solar and the batteries so we can recharge the electric vehicles. We are spending a ton of money, both publicly and privately, between the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. There's like $80 billion that will be spent over a 5-year period on clean energy. And the hope, I don't know where this number came from, but somebody believes that with the help of those federal subsidies, that we will wind up spending $1.6 trillion on renewable energy, and that will hasten the energy transition. So we'll see. The energy transition is going to take a long, long time. Well, if you think about it, we've been transitioning energy since the age of man. So there's really nothing new about an energy transition. But if we're talking about so-called green, carbon-free, carbon-neutral, that transition is going to be a very lengthy and complicated process. And I don't believe we're going to reach net zero by 2035 or 2040 or whatever the latest goal post is. Lots of things have to happen. Number one, renewable energy has got to be cost competitive. And right now, there are a lot of bottlenecks. There's $30 billion of wind investment that's been held up because of supply chain issues, lack of transmission, all kinds of ancillary issues related to installing more wind, more solar. There was a piece, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal a day or two ago that said, hey, if we have to double our spending on transmission infrastructure in order to get these electrons from the wind farms and the solar farms and the battery farms to the end users. And that investment just isn't being made right now. In fact, you can see here, there's actually been a lag in investment in power distribution and transmission equipment. Manufacturing spending has gone up, but if you look at spending for power distribution and generation, that spending has been flat to declining the last couple of years. Green power is getting more expensive. We did see declines, you can see those here, but the last couple of years, again, partly because of supply chain issues, partly because of labor cost issues, transmission bottlenecks, green power is getting pricier after declining for a decade. And there's a whole series of issues related to mining the raw materials that are required. So particularly rare earths. A lot of them come from countries that are not politically stable. There is clearly environmental degradation associated with mining surface minerals, and including rare earths. That process is getting more expensive. So that's another roadblock, if you will. I love this one. We're trying to electrify. There aren't enough electricians. Tried to get one recently. We're just not training enough electricians. So there's a big push now. Oh, we're going to get rid of air conditioners, install heat pumps. Well, you can't do it yourself. You need a qualified technician to do that. And maybe the supply will catch up to the demand, but right now there's a shortage of electricians. So there's going to be a big change in the years ahead, particularly with this big push for EVs and renewables. demand for power in the United States was relatively flat for a long, long time, but it is projected to grow dramatically over the next 25 years, according to the Energy Information Administration. Power demand could surge by 65% or more. And I think that's one of the reasons the Biden administration is, if not actively supporting fossil fuels, is at least has removed some of the barriers to drilling and pipelines, what have you. But the Biden administration seems to be taking a more balanced approach when it comes to energy policy, and despite the rhetoric, recognizing that fossil fuels are important and they're going to be around for a long time. And I think that's an important point to make. That fossil fuels aren't going away anytime soon. This is a projection from our own U.S. Energy Information Administration as part of the Department of Energy. This is their latest report, their outlook from 2022. Probably have another one coming out shortly. But they look to the year 2050 and they say, what's going to be the major source of energy consumption in the United States? It's going to be petroleum. And number two is going to be natural gas. And you can see renewables are increasing their share, as well as their absolute contribution to energy availability, but they're still going to be way behind fossil fuels. Coal is continuing to decline. Not much happening with hydro, and I would like to see a nuclear revival in the United States. And maybe that will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And it's not just here in the United States. If you look at the other purveyor of energy information based in Paris, that's the EIA. I always get them confused. There's the IEA and the EIA. The EIA is the Energy Information Agency, anyhow. So they're looking at world consumption of fuels by fuel type, and they see the same forecasts going out to the year 2040. Liquids, which is mainly petroleum, are going to continue to grow, not as fast as they have in the past. Coal is going to continue to be an important source of energy, particularly for power generation, natural gas as well. And yes, renewables are going to grow, but in their latest forecast in 2040, renewables are still only going to be about 20% of the mix. Now, that could change, but probably not. So, what does this all mean for the oil and gas industry in Texas? Obviously, what happens to global demand is going to affect what happens to demand for energy resources here in Texas, particularly oil and gas. And there have been lots of forecasts of peak demand. Wood Mackenzie did one a year or two ago. They forecast peak demand would be in 2036. Who was it? The Energy Information Administration, I think, said 2040. OPEC said 2050 at the earliest. So we don't know. It's sometime in the future. And even when we get to peak demand, that doesn't mean that oil and gas are going to go away. Even if we can convert every vehicle on the planet to electricity, that would only cut the demand for oil by 40 or 50%, because remember, we use petroleum and natural gas for lots of other stuff besides transportation. The reality is that the world still craves oil. This is a short-term forecast from the IEA that actually sees demand growing somewhat faster than supply for the next couple of years, and they're not factoring in political developments that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. U.S. oil production is predicted to hit an all-time high next year, be above pre-pandemic levels. Almost half of it coming from the Permian. Most of the Permian is in Texas. So on the production side, this is good news for Texas. OPEC, which not surprisingly disagrees with some other assessments, expects oil demand to increase by another 10 million barrels per day. Overall energy demand to jump by 23% by the year 2045. Natural gas demand in the U.S. has jumped dramatically just over the past decade, and most of that production has come from Texas and Louisiana. New record in LNG export capacity. Environmentalists who don't like fossil fuels, they've been fighting these export terminals and pipelines, and now they're trying to push some kind of restrictions on export of liquefied gas. July to bring new highs for U.S. shale oil and gas production, the Permian and the Bakken shale. I mean, despite all the pushback from the Biden administration, despite all the rhetoric about the energy transition and getting to net zero, the oil and gas industry in the U.S. is doing quite well and is expected to do well for the foreseeable future. And that, of course, is good news for Texas. Texas oil and gas industry will thrive. So thanks for your attention. Happy to answer questions.
So I thought I'd share a report that we did for the Texas-Mexico Center here at SMU. It was on migration, job creation, and business formation, and we called it a case for Texas exceptionalism. This is joined with my co-author, Melanie Zabotny, of the University of North Florida. So just to sort of set the stage, as you probably know, Texas tends to have higher job growth than the rest of the U.S. And here you can see in the blue line is usually on top of the red line, that's job growth in Texas versus job growth in the U.S. And with the exception of the oil bust in 2015, 2016, the blue line tends to be, again, above the red line. So we're growing faster. We grow about 1 percentage point faster than the U.S. on average in terms of job growth. Now, when we first started talking about this, the pushback we would get, and this is a long time ago now, but was that, oh, sure, Texas creates a lot of jobs, but they just create minimum wage jobs. So we decided to look, is that true? Do we just create minimum wage jobs? So we divided all jobs into 4 quartiles, and we measured job growth by quartile. And again, here you can see Texas job growth by quartile compared to the U.S. in red. And for the lowest wage quartile, for example, they're both actually, well, in Texas, it's pretty much 0 job growth between 2006 and 2021 in terms of the lowest wage quartile. So those are typically jobs between that pay up to a little over $10 per hour in Texas and $11.42 in the U.S. So you can see that those jobs, of course, we're losing less than the U.S., but those jobs are actually shrinking, and that's actually a labor supply story. We'll get to labor supply here in a minute. But if you look at the other categories in every case, the blue bar is above the red bar. So we are actually creating jobs across the wage distribution, and the premium on job growth is actually quite significant, typically in the top half of the wage distribution. So we're creating lots of high wage jobs in Texas. Why does Texas grow faster? So this is something that goes back a long time. So first of all, we grow faster in terms of job growth, as I mentioned earlier. We also grow faster in terms of output growth. So we have higher GDP growth and we have higher employment growth. Now, of course, oil bust years are an exception. A number of factors boost Texas growth. So geography is important. Our location, central location, international border with Mexico, sea and land ports are very important to growth. Large cities are important. We have many large cities. And actually, large cities are, associated with high productivity growth and high wages. And so cities are important for growth. Plentiful land, industry mix, the fact that we have the energy industry, but again, we are highly diversified at this point. It's not the 1980s Texas with just sort of cattle, cotton, and oil, but we have extensive manufacturing, transportation, we have extensive high tech. And of course here in Dallas, finance and insurance business, business services, and a huge construction industry because we're growing so fast. Population is also really important to growth. So we're young relative to the U.S. Of course, we're aging, though. That's another thing we'll get back to here in a minute. But we're young and fast growing due to relatively high birth rates and net in-migration. Now, net in-migration is going to be the key here because birth rates, like the rest of the U.S., are falling here actually quite rapidly. We have a generally robust public education system. We actually have a standout community college system in many ways. And when I say a robust public education system, I would say the qualifier there is for what we pay for it, it does pretty well. That's sort of how I caveat that. It's actually quite amazing if you look, and that's a whole nother study, but if you look at how little we pay for our public education and the results we get, we're quite efficient in that area, but we could be better. Public policies are important, and I'm really looking forward to Dean's presentation. He's going to follow up with the importance of freedom in markets, open markets that allow entrepreneurship and entry, business entry. So open and flexible markets are important. Overregulated markets are going to, be a deterrent for businesses and for entrepreneurship. And also the state has a tradition of tolerant and big tent policies, and I think those have proven helpful in the past. And to the extent that they're changing, I can't really comment on that, but they've been successful in the past in terms of attracting the talent and the businesses that the state economy, has needed. Relatively low taxes, certainly, and definitely less regulation has tended to lead to lower cost of living. It's less the case now. We actually have affordability in our major metros has now slid under the nation in terms of the national average. But what I say to people who say, does that mean that we're going to have less people moving here and less companies moving here? I said, well, you have to look at where they're coming from. So if they're coming from California, if they're coming from New York, if they're coming from Illinois, we still compare very favorably to Los Angeles, to Chicago, and to New York City, for example, in terms of cost of living. So whereas we are now above the national average, we're still competitive with those areas. And of course, we do have a very favorable business climate. So in this report, we asked, the question really was, how large is migration to the state and its metros? We wanted to look at net inflows. We wanted to look at also inflows versus outflows. We looked at numbers of people versus rates, both in terms of people and businesses moving to Texas. We asked, why do people come? And it turned out it's mostly for employment. It's not like, for example, Florida attracts a lot of migrants, and sometimes you may see a headline that Florida actually has more in-migration than Texas, but those are retirees, so we're focusing on workers, and so that makes a big difference. Then we asked, how is migration related to business formation and job growth? And so here we're going to look at business formation, business entries versus exits, and job growth. So here we're looking at job creation versus destruction to see sort of where does Texas land as we compare to the nation. And then what are the implications for the patterns that we see in the data for the state's long-term growth outlook? What are the benefits of migration for growth? First of all, migrants boost population and workforce. They reduce labor market bottlenecks and skill mismatches. As people are coming for work, they're coming for where the jobs are available. And where the jobs are available is typically more so where we don't have the local labor supply to fill those jobs. And it's true that states that grow consistently faster than the nation typically can only do so by relying on worker in-migration, and that's the case in Texas. Labor influx also increases the return to capital. So what it does, it boosts business investment, and in that way it spurs business formation and job creation. So here's a map. Hopefully you can see this okay. This is migration and the relationship with population change. This is actually just long-run population change. So over the last decade, here you can see in green sort of the states that are growing the fastest. Of course, Texas and Florida, 19% population increase between 2010 and 2021. And they're joined by a few states out west. And then, of course, you can see sort of in the New England and the Midwest and California where we have much, much slower population growth over this period of time. What we saw also more recently is that migration, which this is total net migration into Texas, and what we saw is that we had actually record migration in 2022. And this is actually domestic migration. So it reached 350,000 people on net, so that's inflows minus outflows. And the only year in which it's been higher was in Hurricane Katrina. In Hurricane Katrina, we actually had more migrants in 2005 because of the, basic people had to move out of that area. They were that was struck by the hurricane. So what's interesting here is that you see a decline really in net migration in 2016, 17, and 18, and then increases prior to the pandemic, and then a surge here in the last year. So what was interesting about what happened in the pandemic when we closed the borders was that international migration, which is here in red, fell precipitously. So you can see the red portion of the bar really shrunk in 2020 and 2021, and it increased, of course, in 2022 when we opened the borders back up. But in the meantime, domestic migration, which is the blue portion of the bar, really offset the falling international immigration into Texas. And so that was actually proved very helpful because the pandemic recession only lasted 2 months. It was the shortest recession on record. At the same time, we had record fiscal stimulus, which very quickly turned into very rapid economic growth. We had labor shortages, and we continued to have significant labor shortages, actually. And surprisingly, and we did not anticipate this, we also had this surge in domestic migration into Texas. We didn't anticipate it. It was not really related so much to the strong economy as it was to the work from home trend. So with the pandemic and the change to work from home, many more people were footloose and they could move and they could live anywhere. And so a lot of people moved from California and New York and other places to Texas as a result of the remote work trend. Here you can actually see that what happened. You can see in the top here, those are the in-migration into Florida and Texas since 2011 through 2022, and you can just see and compare and contrast that to California and New York, which had have had net out-migration, net domestic out-migration during this whole period of time, and it was a trend that accelerated during the pandemic. For those states, and it was a trend that accelerated for Florida and Texas during that period of time. Now, you might ask, how do California and New York grow their economy without, with people leaving their states on net? Well, what I'm not showing you here is the international immigration into those states, which is basically how they get by in terms of increasing their population and growing their economy is by bringing international immigrants into their states, but of course domestic migrants are leaving on net. So the interesting thing there is that when we closed the borders in the pandemic, their only source of growth, which is international immigration, fell off, and that's why you can see this very sharp decline or this sharp acceleration really in net out-migration from California and New York during that period of time. And then if you looked at the population change, it was actually a time California and New York both had actually net population decrease. Interestingly, despite the pandemic, in-migration from Mexico actually rose. So here I'm showing you migration from Mexico into Texas and the rest of the U.S. And so I just wanted to make that point. The work that we've done on migration from Mexico shows that actually it's very sensitive to labor market conditions. So if there is a lot of job growth here and rising wages in particular, you typically see more migration from Mexico. The other thing I mentioned that we looked at in this report is how migration interacts with business formation. So first, we pulled census data on business formation. This is establishment entry. So this is biz startups, basically. And you can see the startup rate in Texas in blue compared to the rest of the U.S. in red. And you can say we're consistently higher in the startup rate, or what we call the establishment rate, here in Texas as compared with the nation. We also, you might say, well, we have more startups, but we probably have more business failures as a result. But that's actually not the case. So we actually tend to have lower establishment exit rates, so firm death rates, if you will. Here, the blue line is under the red line for most years, except for the oil bust. We tend to have higher survival rates of new businesses as compared with the U.S. average. So that's a good combination, more startups and more of them survive. But this is all a function of the economic growth and the economic really prowess of the Texas economy. We looked next at the relationship between domestic migration and business entry or net establishment entry rates. And so you can see there's a positive correlation, and we have all states on this chart, and you can see I've circled Texas. And so we have one of the highest business startup rates or net, establishment entry rates, and we have among the highest net domestic migration rate over the period of time that we looked at, and these are very highly positively correlated. Because again, you're not going to start a business if you can't find the workers. So they really have to come together. And we see really that is what happens. And you can see Texas is there with Utah, Nevada, other fast-growing states. So let me summarize. So Texas, in terms of people, Texas draws the highest number of prime working age domestic migrants of any state and Mexican immigrants of any state. We have the highest net migration, both in terms of number and rate, among the large states. And of course, some smaller states, just by virtue of being small, they have higher migration rates than Texas. Texas has among the highest establishment entry rates, so those are business formation, that's our business formation, and they have a below average failure rate for businesses. We also have, and I didn't show you this, but I did show you job growth, but we have above average job creation and below average job destruction in the state. Again, a consequence of the rapid economic growth here. So then there's, between the people and the firms, there's a positive correlation between business formation, job creation, and migration. That's very clear in the data. Of course, the causality runs both ways. You need both of them. More migration will lead to more business formation leads to more migration. And then, of course, international immigration is important too. Thank you so much.
Okay, good evening. So I'm going to pick up right where Pia left off and talk a little bit about population migration and tie it into economic freedom. And typically at an event like this, I would be up here telling the story of how the Texas model of economic freedom leads to prosperity. And I believe that story, but today I'm gonna take a slightly different approach and kind of point out some of the ways where Texas could do better. Because on all of these rankings, you're seeing here on the left a ranking of economic freedom where the blue states are the freest, and then it's a traffic light pattern where green is next, then yellow and red. And as Pia isolated, California and New York have a contrasting pattern on population migration to Texas and Florida, the four largest states population-wise. Well, they also, and that's illustrated on the right with a different map, but these are one-year figures from 2022, whereas you can see Texas and Florida are in the highest group, and New York and California are in the lowest. Well, it turns out on economic freedom, it's the opposite, right? There's that same pattern where Texas last year was ranked first, Florida was ranked first, Texas was fourth, New York was last, and California was next to last. A similar pattern can be seen by, and you can find this in our annual report last year, by looking at local economies, looking at areas like the Dallas metro area, Houston, and that sort of thing. And you see the same pattern here, where it's a blue, green, yellow, red pattern, where blue is most free and red is least free. And last thing on that report that the map just illustrated is, if you look at the top 10 of the biggest metros, it's dominated by Florida and Texas for the most part. And so there's a real story to tell about success in economic policies that are relatively less interventionist in Texas and Florida. But from my perspective, you can always do better, right? So as the title and I should have given Rick credit for the title, always a work in progress. So I'm going to focus on some of that next. And I haven't been in the classroom in 6 years now, I think, or wait, no, 8 years. Sheesh. And so I just had to include this. Sorry to those of you who hate graphs, but this is supply and demand, right? You've got price on the vertical, the quantity on the horizontal, and all I'm trying to illustrate with this, picking up on Pia's point that one of the advantages of the Dallas area is that housing costs are lower. Well, when we see the extreme kind of expansion in population with all these California refugees, that's pushing the demand curve out. And if there's no supply reaction, then price, of course, is going to go up. And we've certainly seen that, right? When you get your property tax bill and you see that, oh, the rate went down, but, oh, why am I still paying more, right? It's because values are rising in general over the last few years. And so a recent Dallas Morning News article said that homes here are now less affordable than Chicago and getting close to New York costliness. So incomes have risen in recent years quite a bit, 45%, but the median home price has more than doubled. Now, if you're a homeowner not looking to move, that doubling of the value of your asset is great. If you're a new, a younger worker trying to get into the housing market and actually buy that first home, or if you're someone with lower means, it's like the price of anything. If it doubles, that makes it less affordable. That's actually a bad thing from the perspective of a consumer. So that is one of the areas where there are threats to the advantages we have. If home prices are no longer quite as competitive as they used to be, then that's going to, at the margin, impact people's location decisions, or it should at least. And so, in another on a theme, wanting to poke the bear, they said, this is the Dallas Morning News again, Texas is going California on its housing policy. And so, I put this out in a post like on LinkedIn, and I had a friend of mine at the Reason Foundation who used to live in California and said, this doesn't really reflect what California is doing. California is actually doing pretty good stuff. So we should actually compare ourselves as even lower than California, I think was his point, which I'm not sure on the details of that. But here are three things in the last legislature that didn't happen, right, that were bills before the House, before the legislature that they could have done to help with the increase in housing prices. Because after all, anytime you have restrictions on the supply of housing, I was trying to get back to the look, if that supply curve shifts out as much as the demand curve did, then you don't see that price inflation. You don't see that affordability crisis that we're seeing now. But we have restrictions on supply that are part of the problem. And that is what the focus of this article was on. ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Basically, the idea is that can you or can you not build something in your backyard, maybe to house your aging parent, or to use as a rental property to rent out to some person who is of lower income and wants some affordable housing. They had the chance to legalize those, and they chose not to. Minimum lot size regulations are basically a way to kind of implement not in my backyard, right? Let's make these minimum lot size big so no one can move into the neighborhood who can't afford a big lot like I have. They had a chance to reduce those statewide. They chose not to. And there are various compatibility restrictions that deal with apartments near single-family homes. And ultimately, this was not something I wrote. This was by, I think, a lawyer in California. But he, at the end, remember the Alamo, sure, but also remember basic economics. Government restrictions on supply lead to increased prices because that supply curve isn't shifting up to match up with the demand curve. Another recent piece on this talked about how Austin just passed some reforms, and everyone in Dallas thinks Austin, that's economically left. How can we possibly not be doing something they're doing? Well, they have reduced their minimum lot size. Now, granted, it's bigger because it's a less densely populated city, but what this article recommended, which was by, I think, a city councilman, is that Dallas should lower the minimum lot size to 1,500 square feet, which is where it is in Houston. And the reason that matters, if it's not obvious, is that if you're trying to build new housing, expand the housing supply so prices can fall, the more land you need for each house, the more expensive, right? So the more expensive it is for you, the more expensive it is for the ultimate consumer of that housing. So the more we can do to get rid of these kind of restrictions on the behavior of people engaging in voluntary exchange, the better off we can be in terms of the affordability of housing in this case. This is another article by a woman at Texans for Reasonable Solutions that's working really hard to try to address the issue of housing cost increases in Texas. There's a new state law that got in place where they're going to streamline the housing permit process, and estimates say that that will reduce new home prices 5% to 25%. Of course, delays in the housing permit process, costs, right? There are costs for the builder that then have to be captured from the consumer. So this hopefully will be one positive thing that's happened lately that can help to offset some of these cost increases. Okay, so moving on. Overregulation. Texas ranks high for economic freedom. That map that was up there earlier, Texas was tied for 4th with Tennessee, behind Florida, New Hampshire, and South Dakota. And that's from a report called the Economic Freedom of North America that I happen to be the primary author of. On a separate report called The Freedom in the 50 States, where they have a focus on regulatory freedom in one of their indexes, Texas ranks only 22nd, right? So the idea that Texas is the freest, well, in this case, on regulations, they're not. They're basically middle of the pack. And Institute for Justice is a libertarian public interest law firm in D.C. They put out a report, I think this is their third one, where they try to measure the impact of occupational licensing restrictions, especially on lower income occupations. And what they found was that in their most recent report, Texas has the 18th most burdensome occupational licensing restriction. That's directly in contrast with this idea of the Texas model of economic freedom, right? So, and it's particularly harmful to those with lower incomes and lower skill and education levels. So these are areas where Texas is falling behind and could improve. Recently, Dallas passed a ban on short-term rentals. And there are lots of opinions on this. I won't go too far with it, but there are roughly 1,700 entrepreneurs that essentially are going to be out of business. And as one described it, it's basically like swatting a fly with a sledgehammer. Sure, no one wants a house party next door to you every night, but that's a law enforcement issue. That's not a zoning issue. And there are ways that law enforcement could do better to rein that in. And to me, that's a law enforcement failure, not an opportunity to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. And by the way, Texas is not unique entirely, but most states haven't done what we're doing here in Dallas, and so some of those entrepreneurs are going to move elsewhere and take their money and their skills and talents to other states that don't have these restrictions. In an op-ed I wrote with a colleague, David Mitchell, at Ball State University, Texas is not very friendly to healthcare consumers. And what I mean by that is that there are 30 states and the District of Columbia that allow patients to get routine medical care from a nurse practitioner. And you might say, well, wait, why don't I just want to go to a regular doctor? Well, part of the answer is that it's cheaper to go to a nurse practitioner. And so this essential ban on the ability of nurse practitioners to do what they're trained for, that 30 other states allow them to do, makes it harder, especially for low-income patients, to get affordable care. The supply of health care is lower, and that drives up the price, just as it does with housing when the supply doesn't expand to meet demand. Texas does a lot, as do most states, with economic development subsidies. There's the Texas CHIPS Act, a fairly recent act that put aside $1.4 billion for subsidies for computer chip fabs. Last year, according to my good friend John Mazzina at the Center for Economic Accountability, Dallas spent about as much on economic development subsidies as it did on libraries and parks and rec combined. So a survey of corporate site selectors said quality of life, right? That's really important to our relocation decision. Libraries and parks, we can argue whether those are quality of life or not, but they're probably more quality of life than giving money to companies to try to bribe them to move where you are. And by the way, those state and local incentives, tax exemptions, were 13th place in the opinion of the people actually making the choices, right, about where these guys are going to locate. So this is an area where we're wasting money. And if any state can say, I'm going to walk away, I'm going to have a mutual laying down of arms on economic development, it's a state like Texas where we have all these other advantages. But here we are upping the ante on everyone else, just doing what everyone else does. So here's another area where we could save the people some money and maybe use that for some tax cuts. School choice is an area where a whole lot of states have made a lot of progress. There are 9 states that have enacted universal school choice. And the example I like to cite is think about our colleges and universities in the U.S. People come from all over the world to attend them. Think about our K through 12 schools. People don't come from all over the world to attend them. What's one of the main differences between the two? Colleges and universities have to compete with each other to attract you. Now, sometimes we're like at Texas Tech, we build the lazy river, we do all sorts of things, and we do plenty of that here where we're essentially not funding the academic mission, but just trying to put in fancy things to attract students. But that competition forces universities and colleges to respond when they're failing. And that's less the case with the K-12 public school system. So this guy here, Richie DeVilliers, is a Texas farmer. He's got a 4th-generation family farm out east of Houston, and there was some highway construction, and it ultimately ended in his land being flooded. He sued the state, right? Who wouldn't? And somehow the Texas state court system took the side of the state that he was not owed any compensation. Our friends at the Institute for Justice, a great group in D.C., it's a libertarian public interest law firm, took up his case, and the U.S. Supreme Court recently agreed to hear it. So maybe Richie here and his family will get some relief from the destruction that state government policies wreaked on them. And ultimately, it's things like this, right, that can erode those advantages that Texas has compared to other states. I'm almost done, I promise. A couple other threats to population growth. So I don't know about you, but I noticed on my property tax bill that the rate had gone down. That's great. Now my total amount owed didn't go down, and so there's that gradual and in some cases substantial increase in property tax burden that can be a deterrent to people moving here or a reason for people to leave. And we had a really large budget surplus this year in the state budget, and we got some reduction, allegedly, but I know my bill was bigger than last year, and I imagine that's true for most of you. And essentially, they passed the largest budget in state history. They had a pot of money in this surplus, said, well, let's just spend it. That's more fun. And finally, the Texas legislators have enacted multiple restrictions on personal freedoms, which is outside of my purview research-wise. But my understanding is that some of those policies are already driving some residents out, maybe some recent refugees from California who find it unfriendly, and discouraging others from moving in. So these are kind of headwinds, right, that could cause Texas to lose some of the advantage that it automatically has. And last but not least, I'll close with an op-ed that my colleague Meg Tazinski and I wrote about 3 years ago now, where, look, a lot of people in Texas are concerned we're going to have this Californication of Texas because all of these lefties from California are coming in here and they're going to vote for high taxes and lots of regulation. Well, it turns out that just like refugees from countries who don't like the policies that are in place there, refugees from California tend to be the people who don't like the policies that are in place there. And as evidence of that in 2018, in the Senate election, the highly contested Senate election, those born outside of Texas voted for the Republican, and we'd think they were here voting for Democratic policies by a 57-42 margin. Native Texans chose the Democrat, O'Rourke, by a 51-48% spread. And I'm not here to talk about partisan politics, but ultimately just this worry that people seem to have that all these Californians are flooding in and it's going to turn the state purple or whatever it is. I think it's a little bit overwrought. There were a lot of efforts in 2020 as well to try to flip the state legislature, and it basically they gained 0 seats. So I think we have nothing but good news for the fact that there are lots of migrants here, and we just need to be cautious to make sure that we maintain the advantage that has brought those people here, because it doesn't take long. I mean, California in maybe, what was it, the 80s was a pretty competitive place with a lot of people moving there, and granted that was a long time ago, but ultimately these advantages can be eroded, and then we're in trouble. And we have maps in the back. Ray's holding up. Shameless plug.
All right. Hey, obviously, none of them knows what 10 minutes means, but whatever. Anyway, it was good information, and anyway, herd them all over here to the to your right, there, my left, and line up with mics and ask them some questions. Time we have left.
My question has to do with the economic impact of higher education. Dean talked some about school choice, but not a lot has been said about higher education. And my question goes first to Pia, because I'd like her to explain the apparent illogic of the state government's approach to higher education. On the one hand, Governor Abbott talks all the time about making Texas's research universities the best in the country. On the other hand, we have Dan Patrick warning that he is going to do away with tenure in the state. The result of that, I understand, is that 43% of the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin are looking for jobs out of state. That seems a contradiction in the way they're approaching this. I might also mention that, of course, there is, because of new laws, there is outmigration of families who have transgender kids, and also I can also already predict that Texas colleges are going to have a harder time attracting the top female athletes because of the abortion laws we have. So there are various things in higher education that are tending toward out-migration rather than in-migration. I wonder, Pia, if you would comment on that.
So can't comment, thank you for the question. Can't comment too directly on sort of the more political stuff, but that's why I did make a point in my presentation to point out the Big Tent was very successful for Texas. The fast-growing economy in the Big Tent, where no group was isolated and targeted with restrictive policies, and that really has been the secret sauce. Education. When we had Ed Glazer, and I believe, wasn't Bridwell, didn't they sponsor Ed Glazer's visit, right? And he is the most famous regional economist in the nation, maybe the world. But at dinner, he said, you say the economy is key to migration and cost of living, and he goes, there's one other thing, and it's migration, it's education. He goes, people are not going to move somewhere where there's not good education. And so the educational infrastructure is absolutely essential to the competitiveness of the Texas economy. Otherwise, we can be one of the other southern states that, are not growing despite low regulation. And I mean, you really need those three things. And we have them now, and we have to cherish and provide the resources for these institutions to continue to thrive.
My name is Raj Devasi. I'm an alumni from this institute. I'm looking at what's happening with cryptocurrency. There's a lot of companies moving into Texas for cryptocurrency from an energy perspective. They're putting containers close to energy sources and creating those. And on the other end, you're looking at security in terms of security. Chinese companies coming and working on cryptocurrency. And now I work on blockchain for products. I'm not against the technology, but from a cryptocurrency, what's Texas' point of view?
Well, I don't know a lot about crypto except that those that mining Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies uses a lot of electricity. And they also use a lot of water. So on the resource side, yes, we've been making efforts to bring these crypto mining firms into Texas, but they're not going to come unless we have adequate electricity and adequate water supply. So far, that has not been a problem, but it could be down the road.
Is our electricity too cheap? That's why they come here instead of going to another place?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's probably cheaper
have
here
had-
than it is in California and a lot of other states.
Cheaper electricity on average in the past. But now with the pressure on the electric grid, that's a real concern.
Yes, what kind of changes and impacts do you see from the declining birth rates?
The declining birth rates, there's not much you can do about it because the drivers are sort of fundamental changes in society, including, women get more education, they marry later. Increasingly, kids today are not marrying at all, so or marrying so late that they only have time for one child. So it's very hard to interfere in the fertility decision. And so, I've written about this in the past with this declines in the birth rate. Probably the best solutions are, other ways to increase workforce growth, including immigration. But there's also tax policy changes and other things we can do to incentivize people to have families, or at least not punish them for having families, because I think there's a lot in the tax code that leaves a lot to be desired.
So I'm a big believer in Julian Simon's idea that people are the ultimate resource. So if you think that, well, X% of the population will turn out to be someone who comes up with some new invention that saves us all money and makes us all better off, the more people you have, the more of those innovative people you get. So I think a decline in population growth is a bad sign for the future, in the sense that we'll have fewer inventors and innovators who can help us all live better lives.
Got two questions. First one is for Pierre. The research that you showed about Mexican immigration, so I'm assuming that's native Mexican, not including the asylum seekers, right?
Yes, that was a report done for the Texas Mexico Center. So yeah, we wanted to look strictly at Mexicans. But yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, that's my question. Okay.
So, if you're referring or thinking to overall migration at the border, that's nothing like the chart that I showed. So actually, I did my dissertation on Mexican immigration, 30 years ago, and that's when Mexico was the #1 sending country to the United States. And now it's far down the list, and Mexican immigration into the United States has actually been flat to declining over the last decade. It just recently turned up. But instead, our #1 sending countries, I think it's now India, and it's been other countries in Asia. So migration patterns have totally changed in terms of legal migration. Of course, on the border, what we're seeing is also a total transition where Mexico has become a transit country, not an origin country. And they're also dealing with, millions of migrants from Central America, from Venezuela, and also from Haiti and other, countries that are suffering, where people are coming and they're asking for asylum. When I was doing my dissertation, they were sort of sneaking across the border. It's not really like that anymore. They're actually asking for asylum, and they're getting in, and then there's a whole process after that.
Okay, thanks. And I have a question for the energy expert, Bernard. I recently drove by California and Nevada border, and I saw that Ivanpah passive solar generation plant. It is impressive. So my question is, if I wanted to go solar, would it be better to more cost-effective for a large-scale solar generation plant, or do it on my home?
Well, industrial scale solar certainly brings down the unit costs. We do have incentives and tax breaks to encourage investment in home solar, but in the large scheme of things, industrial scale solar makes a lot more economic sense.
We'll just take one more.
All right.
Here's one more.
First of all, congratulations on the presentations. They were very interesting. Thank you very much. I guess my question is, since the 3 Mile Island, there's been a lot of technological advances that make nuclear a heck of a lot more safe than it used to be. So other than bad reputation, is there anything else that is stopping us from developing more nuclear in Texas?
I'm a big fan of nuclear. I don't think we're going to see an energy transition or a zero carbon future unless we re-embrace nuclear energy. It is the cleanest way to generate power. What are the obstacles? Obstacle number one is cost. These plants are very expensive to build. This plant in Georgia that's about to come online is wind up costing 300-400% initial estimates. There are reasons for that. I think there are some demonstration projects, what's called modular nuclear plants, that will be cheaper to build. But we don't have the public money and we don't have the private money behind a nuclear revival. There's some chump change in this $80 billion worth of energy spending. A few bones were thrown at the nuclear energy industry, but not enough, I believe, to make any difference. So will we see a nuclear revival? I certainly hope so. I mean, there are issues. The safety issue is a bogus issue. Waste disposal is a bogus issue. It's just been politicized. It's not a technical issue. It's all political. If you remember the brouhaha over that cave in Nevada, what was it called? Where we were going to store the nuclear fuel, and then the Senator Reid was running for re-election, and he didn't like it. And anyhow, I can't even remember the name of that thing. So there is a problem of what do we do with waste disposal. But that, as I say, is a political issue. It's not a technological issue.
Thank you.
One more.
Yes, there's been a lot of media hype around artificial intelligence. So do you see any major impacts coming from AI?
I told them they could ask anything,
Yes.
because you guys are so good.
The answer is yes.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you very much. Thank our